animal ethics, environmental sustainability, personal health. These are the three most common motivations for people to abstain from animal products. And animal ethics is by far the most common motivation, especially among vegans and vegetarians. Every year, or at a given time now, at this moment, there are more than 31 billion land animals, vertebrates, being farmed for food, and billions more fish. It's difficult to estimate how much fish. It ranges between 30 and 200 billion, according to estimates from Scientific Institute. And all these animals are sentient, so they share with humans the ability to experience pain. They're able to suffer and experience well-being. Nevertheless, most of these animals, as you know, live in factory farms. More than across the globe, more than 75%, I don't know the exact number, but in Western countries it's even higher. So they live in these conditions where they are intensively confined. They cannot perform their natural behaviors, and this is typically associated with problems concerning physical health and behavioral problems. And there are also all kinds of other problems, as you probably know. So to deny sentient beings the right to physical autonomy, simply because they belong to another species is inconsistent, and therefore veganism is a logically consistent approach. So the lifestyle to exclude exploitation and abuse of animals as much as possible. But besides animal ethics, there are also other motivations that support a shift towards less animal-based diets, such as environmental sustainability. So compared to plant-based products, if you look at this graph from Clark, compared to plant-based products, animal-based products typically have a much higher environmental impact, so they pollute more nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus. They emit more greenhouse gases, and they typically also use more land and water. And especially red meat can be 10 to 100 times, so red meat from ruminants especially can be 10 to 100 times higher impact. So vegan diets typically have a much lower environmental impact than conventional diets. Then if we look at health, then there's literature that red meat, especially processed and unprocessed meat, are associated with diseases of welfare, just as heart disease, bowel cancer, diabetes, and stroke, and these are associated with living less longer. But these associations are, there's the evidence for this is difficult to disentangle, because eating a lot of meat is often associated with other unhealthy habits. So it's not entirely clear, such as people who eat more meat often also eat less plant-based, and the evidence that plant-based is associated with good health is stronger. So so eating more plant-based food is typically associated with lower risk of these diseases of welfare and living longer, healthier lives. So a vegan diet, as you probably know, can be healthy can be very healthy if it's well planned. But there's also an umbrella review recently that did show weak evidence for an increased risk of bone fracture, and this might be due to lower intakes of vitamin B12, D, calcium, or protein. So vegans should be careful to have enough of these nutrients via fortified foods or a supplement in case of vitamin B12 is certainly, and D is certainly recommended. So the health argument for veganism is not the strongest argument. Omnivorous diets can also be healthy if they have low meat intake, but it's also it can be a supportive argument to shift towards more vegan diet. Nevertheless, despite these arguments, calls for change from vegan advocates are often resisted by the majority, or they exert ambivalence in people, so they don't really know how to respond. And in literature, the meat-eating group is often called omnivores, so I will also use this term. In literature, there has been a lot of research on which factors influence this resistance or the behavior of omnivores, so ranging from large-scale factors such as history, technology, economy, to individual factors such as habits, motivations, opportunities like the availability of plant-based food, and capacities, the ability to cook, although this is less researched. But social factors have also been less researched. So I will ask this question: who has a dog? So yes, so what I did is I created a sense of belonging to a group where the self is defined in terms of group membership. So I said who has a dog, and some people raised their hand, so they belong to the people who have a dog, and other people don't have a dog. So I create a sense of belonging to a group, and this can be called social identity. So an emotional connection based on a category you belong to. And social identity can be contrasted with personal identity, where people just identify themselves as individuals. And according to social identity theory, people can flexibly identify as individuals or groups depending on their social environment, like I just demonstrated before I asked the question, who has a dog? You probably didn't think about your membership in the dog having group. According to social identity theory, people also desire a positive and distinct identity. And combined with social identification, this can cause an us-them group thinking, so also known as in-group favoritism. And I was curious whether this in-group favoritism or these biases also play a role in relationships between omnivores and vegans. So I wrote a dissertation on the perceptions of omnivores towards vegans in promoting more plant-based diets or plant-based diets. And via this research, I got more insight into the ideological resistance against vegan advocacy. So in my first study, I mainly examined stereotypes, and then based on this experimental study, I developed a theoretical framework, and these two studies I will explain more elaborately, and I will also discuss this last study a bit. So we have the majority of omnivores, and then we have a minority of vegans who is typically morally motivated, and because of their moral motivations they can elicit a broad range of impressions ranging from admiration to being perceived as less socially attractive and associated with stigma and negative stereotypes. So my question was, can negative stereotypes predict a lower social attractiveness of vegans? And I also looked at vegetarians, and I also looked at flexitarians, so people who consciously eat less meat. So to develop my hypothesis, I relied on stereotype content theory. So this is a term I invented to refer to theories that try to identify or capture stereotypes in a limited set of dimensions. So you have agreeable, sociable, moral, competent, and we try to capture them. So in my first study, I relied on the model of Lundy, and he distinguishes 3 sets of dimensions. So you have a morality dimension, a sociability, and a competence dimension. And morality captures whether someone has helpful or harmful intentions. So this is probably the most important dimension. Then you have the sociability dimension, which refers to an ability to connect with others, which can be captured with traits like warm and friendly. And then you have competence, which refers to a personal ability to attain goals. And I theorized that vegetarians, and especially vegans, would be seen as more moral, but also as less sociable because they're a minority group, and that the competence, that there would not be a difference in perceived competence. In addition, I also hypothesized that there would be 2 additional important stereotypes associated with morally motivated minorities, namely that they would be perceived as moralistic, so having a self-righteous and narrow-minded attitude, and being eccentric, abnormal, slightly strange. And this hypothesis was based on my own experience and also group interviews with omnivores and vegetarians and vegans who reported having had experience with moralistic or extreme vegans and vegetarians. And for example, the eccentric hypothesis, in Austria there are about 11% vegetarians and 2% vegans, and these percentages are quite consistent across Western countries. So I assumed that they would be perceived as less normal. And these would then predict a lower sociability and a lower social attractiveness. So this is a model. Vegans and vegetarians would be perceived as more moral, but also as more moralistic and eccentric, which would predict a lower sociability and lower social attractiveness. So what did I do? I developed a questionnaire, and I recruited omnivores via an online platform, and I randomly allocated them to answer questions about either typical omnivores, which were defined as people who ate both animal and plant-based foods without any restrictions, and flexitarians who consciously reduce their meat intake now and then, and vegetarians who abstain from meat, and then vegans. I defined them in dietary terms to make it more comparable, who were defined as abstaining from animal products and products tested from animals. So I recruited those omnivores from UK, and I gathered a diverse sample with various ages. This distribution of sexes is common in studies of psychology, and most of them ate meat regularly. So the omnivores were exposed to the experimental manipulations. I first asked, I did a free association task, which means I asked people to associate 3 traits that come to mind when they think of the group they were exposed to. And then I asked them to rate these traits, or positive or negative, by themselves. And then I used direct measures to measure how moral, moralistic, etc. they are perceived to be. So also with using scales like these, with 7-point scales. I also measured competence, and then the questionnaire was done. So these were the results. So the vegans and the vegetarians were seen as less socially attractive, but also as more moralistic, and these effects were large. Vegans and vegetarians were also seen as more eccentric or less normal, and also as more moral. And only vegans were seen as less sociable than omnivores and vegetarians. For competence, there was no difference. And then if we look at flexitarians, the traits that were associated with them were in between. So like omnivores, there was no difference in social attractiveness or moralisticness, but like vegetarians and vegans, flexitarians were seen as less normal and more moral. And for sociability and competence, there was no difference. Okay, then if we look at our model, I found that basically all my hypotheses were confirmed. So indeed, vegans and vegetarians were seen as more moralistic and eccentric, less sociable, and then less socially attractive. But the moralistic stereotypes were by far the strongest predictor of the social attractiveness of vegetarians and vegans. But what was also interesting is when I controlled for moralistic and eccentric impressions, I saw that vegetarians and vegans were also seen as more sociable. So I looked if this could be explained by their perceived morality, and indeed, so morality could explain this. So on the one hand, they're seen as less socially attractive, mainly because of these moralistic stereotypes, but they're also seen as somewhat more socially attractive in a hidden way because of the higher perceived morality. And if we compare vegetarians and vegans, then we find similar results. So vegans are seen as less socially attractive because of higher moralistic impressions. Then I looked at these three associated data. So we see that omnivores, flexitarians, and vegetarians had mainly positive associations, and for vegans there was a significant difference, so they were more ambivalent. I then tried to identify the content of these associations, and I identified different teams, such as a literal team, like here meat eaters instead of omnivores, physical teams, so healthy, all groups were seen as healthy apparently, but here also unhealthy. And then also a psychosocial team, so referring to those psychological traits. So I identified these teams that are already theorized to exist, but I also identified the commitment team. So this refers to a motivation, dedication, or certainty to attain a goal, which can be distinguished from an ability to attain goals. And I also identified like the typical dietary motivations that the vegetarians and vegans have. So health conscious, eco-friendly, and animal lovers are also common positive traits. So vegans and vegetarians are often seen as more moral and committed and more motivated by these typical motivations, but are also seen as less sociable, more eccentric, and more moralistic. And these moralistic impressions strongly predict the lower social attractiveness of vegans. And for the omnivores, they were seen as more sociable, normal, not moralistic, and less moral, but there were not a lot of negative traits. And flexitarians had an in-between profile, so they were seen as more sociable, less moralistic, but also motivated by environment and health, but seen as more eccentric and as lacking commitment. So we can, in this specific commitment phobe, these were the traits that were associated with flexitarians. So how do these findings compare with the attitudes of vegans and vegetarians themselves? If you look at the literature, you will find that vegetarians, the more you go to the right, the more strongly motivated people will be to follow their diet, and they will be especially more motivated by animal ethics, and their diet will be more central to their moral identity. So vegans and vegetarians typically see their diet as a reflection of a moral philosophy. But they also experience more stigma, so resembling this lower sociability, and they also will report in interviews that they view the outgroups less positive. So there is some truth in this stereotype, but at the same time, I wasn't satisfied with this explanation, so I further examined the moralistic stereotype of vegans. So why would the vegans be perceived as more moralistic? So on the one hand, So we had this evidence vegans might look down on omnivores, but at the same time many vegans also report that they try to avoid appearing moralistic when engaging with omnivores. And there's also evidence that a mere exposure to vegans among omnivores then omnivores will expect a moral rejection. And the more they expect this moral rejection, the more likely they will negatively stereotype vegans and vegetarians. Then there is also the research of Melanie Choi, you probably know. So she poses that just like there is a belief system that justifies the non-consumption of animal products, veganism, there is a belief system that justifies or tries to justify the consumption of animal products, which is carnism, or she called it carnism. And based on this research and also research that stereotypes typically help to justify in-group behavior, I theorized that these moralistic stereotypes could also be like a justification for eating animal products or function like that. And it could be perceived as a distortion of those moral commitment perceptions. So moralistic stereotypes could be further distinguished in two facets. So a moral person is someone who is good, an arrogant person is someone who thinks he's better than others, and an overcommitted person is just someone who is too committed to his own goals. And I called this mixed valence perception, like the vegan paradox. And this was the topic of my second study. I wanted to explain this paradox within the context of vegan advocacy. So I called this the vegan paradox because it reminded me of the meat paradox, and there has been a lot of literature about this so-called meat paradox, and this refers to the inconsistency that a lot of people care about animals, but at the same time also eat them. So, and this inconsistency is likely to arouse negative feelings of discomfort, and according to you have cognitive dissonance theory, which tries to explain this, but you also have self-based revisions that look at the role of identity. So you can reinterpret this meat paradox as a paradox between someone's moral identity, so people want to be a good person and they want to avoid harm, but and on the other hand their carnist identity, which I define as their self-identity related to the consumption of animal products. So I am not vegan and I want to keep eating animal products. So there is a contradiction there. So how do people solve this contradiction? Well, one way to solve this is by accepting the belief that eating animal products is harmful and avoidable. So aligning your behavior with your moral identity and taking steps towards vegans or ultimately becoming vegan. And thereby also challenging the inconsistency of eating some animals and not others. But of course, there are also other ways to deal with this paradox, otherwise most people would already be, the change would be faster. So there's also motivated ignorance, so people might resolve this stress or inconsistency threat by ignoring that there is harm, and this justifies the belief that eating animal products is harmless. But people might also actively defend their habits by rationalizing that animal products don't have feelings, or by believing that eating animal products is unavoidable. And the most common justifications are here. So you have the necessary, that eating meat and other animal products is necessary, natural, normal, and nice. So necessary, that it's necessary for your health. So it's a health requirement. natural, that we evolved as omnivores, so we need meat to survive, so it's a natural requirement. Normal, that everyone does it, so it's a social requirement. And nice, yeah, it's just too tasty, I cannot give it up, so a hedonic requirement. People might feel dependent on meat. So these defenses together, these justifications, these form the belief system of Carnism, and this would then provide a legitimacy to treating different animals inconsistently by eating some and not others. So in my framework, I then pose that when vegan advocates raise awareness that eating animal products is harmful and avoidable, this will arouse the meat paradox, and because their moral identity will become salient, they might perceive vegans as more moral and committed. And this will lead to a higher social attraction, because morality is a highly attractive trait, and this might lead to a higher willingness to eat more plant-based or vegan diets. But on the other hand, people might also feel morally threatened. So, and because of this self-threat, they might justify eating animal products. So they don't see any moral legitimacy in this message, at least temporarily. So they will see the vegans as more arrogant and overcommitted, and these are socially unattractive traits, and this would support an unwillingness to change. So how then do we promote veganism? Within the vegan movement there is a debate, a common debate, like whether an idealistic approach would be used or a pragmatic approach. And the idealistic approach is quite black and white, quite simple. Go vegan for the animals, it can be summarized as such. So commit to going vegan for the moral reasons. The pragmatic approach is more practically oriented on the question how to change behavior. So it allows for incremental steps like eat less meat or other motives. And according to my framework, both approaches have their pros and cons. So the idealistic approach signals moral commitments, and these are attractive traits. It also signals a clear goal, and it grabs attention. But on the other side, it might arouse resistance. And the pragmatic approach can avoid this resistance, is more socially flexible, but on the other hand, you have less of this moral commitment, so people might move more towards this, but if they don't have the moral commitment, research also shows that they might be more likely to go back. So once they have the moral commitment, it's less likely, but they're also more likely to stick. People might think, like, because this idealistic approach causes resistance, that they think that it is not effective. But when I wrote this paper, I also looked a bit into minority influence literature, and this was quite interesting. So I found that there's this meta-analysis of minority influence research, and this research found that the influence minority exerts compared to majorities is often indirect, private, and delayed. What does it mean? Indirect means that, for example, you might promote veganism, but people will only eat less meat. So they are indirectly influenced. They don't accept the position fully, but to a certain extent. Private means that they might show resistance, but privately there might be something that they agree with. And delayed means that the influence is often at a later point in time. So it is possible that they respond in a defensive way, and afterwards they think about how they dealt with this argument, and they might think, actually, he had this person had a good point. So they might afterwards think about the arguments and evaluate the arguments, and in such a way it might be possible that they change their mind. So often indirect, private and delayed. Not always, but okay, this is research. And according to this meta-analysis, minorities are especially effective if they are consistent, defined and small. So especially this consistency is important, but it is not entirely clear why this is the case, but one could speculate that if you have a consistent minority, that you are more clearly visible. And based on cognitive dissonance theory, you could also assume that they are able to more convincingly challenge the inconsistency of the majority by signaling that the majority is inconsistent. And if you are especially consistent, then you provide the alternative that the majority should shift to your position. If you are inconsistent, you can easily be accused of being a hypocrite, so that is probably less motivating. So a potential downside, it is not necessarily the case, but if you are consistent, a possible risk is that you come across as rigid, and if you don't consider the perspective of your, the one the omnivore target, then you might come across as more self-centered. So these arrogant and overcommitment traits, you might come across as moralistic. And so it is also important to stand in the shoes of the one that you try to influence. Minority influence research also shows that a consistent minority can be more effective if they have a flexible negotiation style. So this means that they are prepared to make some compromises, but especially when the differences in opinion are large. So an example of a flexible negotiation style is dynamic communication. So rather than suggesting that a vegan diet should be adopted directly, radically now, you can communicate it in a more, saying that it's a gradual transition or sharing your own personal experiences. Of course, if it was a radical transition, you can also say, but yeah. And of course, from the perspective of the animals, it should be good if it would be as fast as possible, but at the same time, we should also be pragmatic, especially when the difference in opinion is large. And also we can be pragmatic by being more supportive of incremental changes. So this might motivate them to take more steps. And another trait of, an important trait of successful minorities is that they are innovative, so they constantly try to seek the balance between idealism and pragmatism, consistency, flexibility, and they try to look for new creative ways to remain visible. So I will now look at, so we can further discuss different components of the process of vegan advocacy by looking at traits of the advocate, the target, and the message, so the motive and call for change. So as I will first talk a bit about the advocate. So an effective advocate is consistent, has a flexible style, and is innovative according to minority influence research. But we can also look at source credibility research, and according to this author, this source credibility consists of 3 components. So the more similar you are perceived to be to the target, the more likely you will be able to exert influence. So you have likely more influence on your own social network than strangers or people that have matched identities in general. You are also more likely to have influence when you are trustworthy. So also people from your social network or celebrities. These are just examples. There might be more. And another component of this model is expertise. So people that are seen as experts are seen as more objective. So people will trust them also more and will be more willing to accept their arguments. And related to this variable, there was a study that found that people were more willing to eat less meat after they had a dialogue with activists that were trained to formulate counter-arguments to these normal, necessary, nice arguments. So this is promising research. If we look at the omnivore target, based on my theorizing, you could make a graph with moral identity and carnist identity, and you have people with a strong moral identity but with a low carnist identity. And based on empirical research and theorizing, I would expect those people to be most willing to accept the arguments of vegan advocates and most willing to change. Those with a high moral identity and a high carnist identity are more likely to be ambivalent about their moral and carnist identity, and they're probably more likely to exhibit motivated ignorance, so more motivated to ignore the arguments but not actively defend the arguments. And these people are more likely to change when they can no longer ignore the arguments. So these people are more likely to have personality traits they are more likely to be agreeable and open to experience, openness to change. They're more likely liberal, and they're also more likely to be female and highly educated. So these are statistics. I don't want to suggest that it's black and white, but they're just more likely to be in those categories. Those with a strong carnist identity, a lower moral identity, are more likely to be attached to meat and more likely to actively defend their eating habits by engaging in motivated reasoning. So this normal, natural, nice, all these kinds of justifications that strengthen their commitment to their habits. And these are more likely people with opposite personality traits, so disagreeable, more dominant personalities, more close-minded. I don't want to suggest that all meat eaters are close-minded, but there is a higher likelihood, and they're also more likely to be conservative, and also more likely to be male, that endorse traditional masculinity. So the idea that men should be strong and real men eat meat. So these are more likely to be in this category. And then you have people with a low carnist and lower moral identity, and these are likely to be indifferent. I expect them to follow the path of the least resistance. So removing practical barriers for them is most important, but this is also important for all the other people. And of course, there are many other variables that play a role in behavioral change, such as these capacities that I mentioned, so the ability to cook, your education, and also opportunities. So the availability of alternatives is also important to be able to make a change. So then I will briefly discuss motives for change. So you would expect that the more moral the argument, the more likely advocates are perceived as morally committed, but also as more moralistic. But I will soon go to my next study. I will first show this recent study which found that the environmental and the ethics arguments, so the animal ethics arguments, were most likely to arouse dissonant feelings, so these negative feelings of discomfort, and these predicted a higher willingness to eat less animal products. So these personal health arguments were not perceived as persuasive, probably because health is not a consistent argument for veganisms, because low meat diets with a little amount of meat can also be unhealthy, so they're not as persuasive probably. And the environmental arguments were also less convincing when asked to cease, so to completely abstain from animal products. Then only the animal ethics arguments were convincing. I will go back to these motives for change in my own study, but I will now discuss call for change. So there are also, 10 minutes, that's good. Radical messages go vegan. The incremental message includes all kinds of variables such as eating less meat, smaller portions, less days meat, etc. So regarding this radical message, a meta-analysis of Matur et al. Found, so they did a meta-analysis on the effect of animal welfare interventions on meat reduction, and they found that a recommendation to go vegan was more effective than a go vegetarian and an eat less meat message to induce meat reduction. But it's also important to note that the study participants were probably already more willing to change. So this relates to this flexibility point that I made before. If the difference in opinion is larger, incremental approaches can be more successful. This is also supported by research from Lacroix. He found, or she found, I don't know, that meat reducers, that the more successful strategy for meat reducers is to support existing intentions, so related, similar to this. But for people who are highly meat attached, it's more promising to focus on meat substitution within familiar meal formats. So just replacing meat with a meat alternative would be more effective. So then I will shortly discuss my last study. And in this study, I took a sample of omnivores in the UK again, and I randomly allocated them to answer questions about a vegan advocate motivated by animal ethics or a so-called vegan advocate motivated by health. And I was also interested in comparing these advocates with non-advocating vegans. So, and again, they were exposed to a description of these different kinds of people. And what I found was that advocating vegans were seen as more moralistic, as you would expect. And those motivated by animal ethics were also seen as more moralistic. And this again predicted lower social attractiveness. But at the same time, what was interesting to see is that the not advocating vegans, the animal ethics vegan was seen as more moral than the health vegan. And this was a medium difference. But as soon as the animal ethics vegan was described as an advocating one, this difference disappeared. And if we look at the persuasiveness, the pattern is similar. So the silent animal ethics vegan is seen as most persuasive. And if we look at health, we see that the health vegans are just seen as healthy at a certain level, but the silent animal ethics vegan is seen as similar, but the advocating animal ethics vegan is seen as less healthy. So this strongly suggests motivated reasoning against the advocating animal ethics vegan. And it reminds of a pattern in minority influence research that people might privately agree with the arguments of vegans, But as soon as the vegan deviates from social norms by actively advocating, that there is public disagreement. And I also found that the more people identified as omnivore, or if they were not flexitarian, or if they were males, then they would endorse carnism more, so these justifications. And these justifications predicted higher moralistic stereotyping, but also lower moral impressions, and especially when the vegans were motivated by animal ethics. And this suggests a phenomenon of a do-gooder derogation. So with these health arguments, so suddenly the vegan advocate is seen as less healthy, less moral, and less persuasive. So just like people might have ambivalent feelings about caring about animals and eating animals, they might have ambivalent perceptions of vegans as being both morally committed and arrogantly overcommitted. And and people have to, vegan advocates need to try to find a way to deal with these mixed balance perceptions. And to end on a positive note, I want to note that veganism is increasingly going mainstream in many Western countries, so there are more and more vegan products, vegan businesses, vegan celebrities, so it becomes increasingly popular, and as people shift and as the majority norms shift, the idealistic approach is probably becoming more and more effective until the point that it might become just taken for granted, just like we treat our companion animals. Maybe in the future we will also treat other animals like those we farm now in a better way. But until this point, it's important to also be pragmatic so that we can remove the practical barriers that make social change difficult for those people. So I want to thank VEREIN for inviting me to present this talk. I want to thank Ghent University, the funders, and Phonalytics for supporting my research. If you're interested in more of this kind of research, I recommend to take a look at Fair Society. And these are the references that I used in the presentation. And if you have any questions, you can ask me now, and these are my contact details. So you can also contact me later. Thank you.